Sure.
All right. So I apologize for this. Go ahead and sit back and take a nap if you want. But as you can imagine, this particular item hits pretty close to home for me. I'm probably the only one that has read more comments and heard more comments than Ms. Barrios Cool, because I've done it over the last 10 years. It's been that long. It's been a big case and a big part of the reason why I'm here, to be honest. A lot of people in this room can remember that. So anyway, the speech that I have is, as many of you know, this particular issue, which started with me having to take Johnson Utilities to task for a water dispute, ultimately snowballed into me, Chairman Thompson, being up here today. Since the sale of the utility to EPCOR, I never got a chance to talk to George Johnson before he passed away a little over a year ago, but I do wonder what he would say now. So with that said, I want to give a huge thank you to EPCOR through all of this. When it was time for Arizona to appoint an interim manager, I recall, and some of these things are just my memory, so it may differ from what Mr. Baxter said, but I recall there were only two options. One of them was EPCOR, and the other one was a joint option between the town of Florence and the town of Queen Creek. At the time, I explicitly remember being very upset at the optics of that, and the then utility director having appeared to pick EPCOR prior to even considering the discussion. I'm not saying that was necessarily the wrong decision, but I felt the towns deserved a better platform before the decision was made. It was a string of these types of events all these years ago that led me down the path of knowing that I had to do something to address this professionalism, morale, and transparency at the commission, and I'm happy to say that I feel that we have been very successful in that mission. So now, back off the tangent, I was talking about EPCOR. When it came time to actually purchase the utility, which I'll point out that when they were the interim manager was not necessarily a foregone conclusion, there was only one company that actually stood up to take on that challenge, and that was EPCOR. Even the towns that had earlier showed an interest in the system, who border those systems, did not show up to the table. As I recall, it literally came down to EPCOR purchasing the system or EPCOR abandoning the interim manager position and things going back to the way they were. And speaking of the way they were, I'll recap some of the highlights that EPCOR kind of had dumped in their lap. Let's see. There were, as Mr. Baxter pointed out, a massive number of lift stations of that size. This utility had about 40,000 connections for their wastewater system, and I remember a total of 33 lift stations. To put that in perspective, the city of Phoenix had 40 lift stations at the time for 2.5 million people. So it's a big disparity. And the sanitary sewer overflows were happening on average of more than once a week, and largely due to the mismanagement and bad planning of those sanitary sewer overflows. There was absolutely no money being put back into the system, other than what was required to keep it running. Every bit of it was being put into the pockets of the Johnson Family Trust or George directly. Multiple companies held by the Johnsons did not need to go through any kind of bidding process or anything like that to work on the system. They were just held captive because he owned all of those companies. Billing issues were perceived at the time as fraud. I'm not so sure those feelings weren't justified in a certain amount of truth, but it was things like snowbirds having no leaks anywhere on their property and who were out of town at the time for 6 months at a time were getting water and sewer bills that claimed they filled up the equivalent of a couple of Olympic-sized pools, which, as you can imagine, was very shocking to some of them. Bribery on the commission at the time. I won't get into the details, but it ended up in a full-fledged FBI investigation, and it ultimately was resolved with a civil lawsuit with a pittance of the money being returned to the ratepayers. George would destroy families if anyone ever spoke up, and I'm talking about financial ruins, lawsuits, etc. This could be anywhere from a complaint about brown water coming out of your faucets to defending themselves against or regarding sexually inappropriate or abuse in the workplace. And to top it all off, at one point there was a very believable but ultimately unprovable allegation that George Johnson threatened to slit the throat of the then town manager of Florence over an incident in which the town manager caught a JU truck carrying wet sewage to put on farm fields as fertilizer. Now, I don't want to get into George's storied history and mob-style antics, but from personal experience, I know that he threatened me. One of them was literally in the very back row on that side of this hearing room. He threatened my daughters right there, just by whispering in my ear. He threatened me regarding my livelihood. He threatened to take me to court if I didn't stop pushing, to civil court, if I didn't stop pushing and fighting against every move that he had. So with all of this, I would find it hard to believe that the leadership and the owners of EPCOR did not get similar treatment from George, yet they persevered through it. Luckily, to all of them and me and the town manager, none of us ended up like Don Bowles. And if you know the history of that, you'll understand the reference. But so when I say that the decision today is a little bit bittersweet, I don't think it comes as much of a surprise. I have a deep understanding of just how bad things were back then. I understand the enormity and the scale of work that EPCOR had to endure to make things better, and they're still continuing to this day. On the other hand, I also have compassion for my neighbors, many of whom became my friends during all of this. I also understand how they feel that they have had to pay. Ms. Barrios-Cool mentioned twice. We believe in many respects we might have had to pay 3 or 4 times for the same exact utility system. I understand how they feel when it took EPCOR quite a while to get things under control, that many in the community didn't even see the drastic improvements that have occurred over the years. I understand people smelling sewage at their dinner table for years, even after EPCOR took over. And under certain conditions, you still cannot drive down Ironwood without getting a literal taste of the past. Albeit much better, and I'm not dogging EPCOR because they've done an incredible job, but it just goes to show how bad that system was, even significantly improved. I understand the inconsistent billing issues. Some of them were even addressed in this particular rate case, 10 years after the fact. So with that said, I'm happy to finally have what I consider the end of an era with this particular rate case as the first one that was filed by EPCOR being the owner. And sad that it had to go so bad that this increase in rates was so inevitable. And now I, as the guy who fought so hard for so many years, must approve a rate case increase largely due to the mismanagement under Johnson Utilities. I don't like being in this position. I don't like voting for this increase or really any increase for any utility for that matter. And I'm truly sorry for everything my friends have had and neighbors have had to go through for the past about 30 years, which is now culminating in one final blow to their budgets, albeit with a much improved water and wastewater system. And now that I've had that said, I vote aye on this item.